look good on me, but it'll probably look better on you. So that's what it looks like. I would probably wear it slouchy like that, but I do not look good in red. So I don't know. Messed up my hair again. So we'll start here pretty soon, give everyone a chance to get in the room. And we're gonna learn how to do Fair Isle and talk about some other color work techniques. I knitted the hat up in different, it's the same hat, but just by changing the colors, you can make it look very different. So I wanted to do that as a contrast to show you the differences. And this one, I only knitted part of the way. So there's some interesting things happening right there. So that's what we'll get to. Any questions before we start? Okay, somebody, I can kind of read the comments. Somebody said it looks so hard. And I agree, it does look very, very hard. But once we get into reading the pattern and looking at the chart, you're gonna see it's really not as hard as it looks. It's much, much easier than you think. It looks so complicated, I know, but it's really not. So somebody said color work and knitting that uses more than 2 colors. So this one uses more than 2 colors, but not more than 2 colors in one stripe. So Fair Isle knitting is a very specific niche of knitting, and that's what we're going to talk about. But I do have some other examples. I'll probably show these again later. So this one, this sweater that I made, it has up to 5 colors in some rows, which makes it kind of a big tangled mess by the time you're done. So different kinds. There's no pattern for this. I just made it up as I went along. I don't like to be told what to do. Claire, do you think we're ready to start? Or?
I think we can go ahead, yes. I was gonna say hi, everybody. I'll be hanging out in the chat room, answering your questions as best I can and feeding them to Darren. Darren is, of course, you're gonna be your lovely instructor today. He has previous experience. He taught for 10 years at the Lion Brand Yarn Studio in New York, taught knitting, felting, dyeing, embroidery, all kinds of stuff. But today he's gonna be showing you how to do Fair Isle. So take it away, Darren.
All right, so just a few things before you even start knitting. You want to make sure you're setting yourself up for success. So the first thing you want to do is you want to pick 2 colors that are very contrasting so that you really see the pattern. So when you pick a contrasting color, you want to have also light and dark colors. So contrasting in the level of saturation the colors have. If you have red and green, which are very contrasting, but they're both very dark, you're still not going to see a huge difference in the pattern, and you'll do a lot of work and not get much out of it. So pick 2 colors that have a strong contrast. Usually wool yarn is the traditional choice for Fair Isle, but acrylic works great. You can use any kind of yarn that you want, really, but what you don't want is something that's really slippery. So usually cotton is not so good, but you can always give it a try and see what you like. It doesn't hurt to try. And the place for you to try that is in a gauge swatch. So I know everybody hates gauge swatches, and for a hat, I really never make a gauge swatch because there's not really much use to. But when you're learning a new technique, you really want to make sure you're setting yourself up for success. And so the gauge swatch tells you a couple things. It doesn't just tell you if you're knitting to the right gauge. It also tells you if you like these colors together and if you're getting a good contrast or not. So I'm going to hold this up. So you can see there's a burgundy and gray, which really doesn't show up hardly at all. And then when I switch to the red and gray, there's much more of a contrast and you can really see it. So if you want something that's really subtle, then you can do colors that are very on the same level of saturation. But if you want colors that, or a pattern that's going to be more bold and show all of the hard work you did, then you want to make sure that you pick colors that are contrasting like this. So
I have a good tip about that. Sorry, Darren.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you are trying to figure out what colors and you don't know if there's enough contrast, take a picture and then switch it into black and white and see if you can still tell the difference between the two balls of yarn.
That is good. That's a very good idea. So when you knit a gauge swatch for an item that you're making in the round, you can't knit it flat the traditional way. You can't knit across and then purl back, knit across and purl back if you're doing stockinette stitch in the round, because when you do a purl stitch, it's actually a little bit looser and your gauge will not be accurate. So if you're really trying to get a nice accurate gauge swatch, I'm going to show you how to do that without casting on a whole bunch of stitches. So if you're working on a 16-inch needle, you'd have to cast on 40 or 50 stitches to get it around that. And that's a lot of work for just a gauge swatch. So what you do is you cast on a double pointed needle. So you just need 2 double pointed needles. And you knit across. So I've knitted across. And then in the back, instead of purling back, you never turn your work. You're always looking at the front. What you do is you bring the yarn this way. You just bring the yarn and you're just carrying it in the back. And it's fine because this is just a gauge swatch. And then what you do is just start knitting. You just start knitting like normal. So any questions about that, how the gauge swatch works? Just kind of do it like that. Another thing that is very important before you start is to read the entire pattern before you really get started, to make sure that there aren't any surprises or any new stitches that you don't know. Because if you get in the middle of it and then you realize you don't know how to do it, and it's always a good idea to learn something new, but if it's something that's more complicated than what you wanted to get into, it's nice to know that before you start. So it's double checking, looking at the chart. We're going to talk about how to read the chart. So that's pretty much all the preparation you need. You need to just make sure you have everything ready, and we're really ready to knit. So is everybody ready to knit? Okay, so if we want to switch to this one. So if you look at the pattern, the prerequisite is you must have a solid understanding of knitted increases and decreases and be able to recognize the knit and the purl stitch. And you must know how to knit in the round. Traditionally, Fair Isle is always knit in the round, but you can break tradition anytime you want. So you cast on a 16-inch needle, and I'm ready to join in the round, and I am going to show you quickly how to join in the round. So you just make sure your stitches are not twisted. Just double check and be sure that they're not twisted. And you want to make sure that your working yarn is coming from the right side. So the working yarn will be coming from your right hand. And you don't want to knit with the tail by mistake. And then all you do is you just knit a normal stitch. And then that is going to join your work in the round. And so you knit all the way around in pattern, however it wants you to do that. And then when you get back to the beginning, you want to double check and make sure it's not twisted. And at that point, once you go past that point, then it's either twisted or not twisted. You're kind of stuck with it. It's always a good idea to put a stitch marker right before you start. And then that way you always know where the beginning is. When you finished a round. I don't always do that because sometimes the tail can just act as the marker, but however you want to do it. So that's basically it's the cast on and how to join in the round. Joining in the round, you just make sure your yarn's coming from the right hand side and then just knit a stitch and just work in pattern. You want to pull that area a little tighter than you normally would to close up that gap. And then if there is a little gap there, it doesn't matter because you can use the tail to kind of sew it shut, okay? So that is how to join in the round. And after you join in the round, let's see. It wants you to knit your ribbing for 2 inches. So for knit purl ribbing, I'm going to demonstrate that quickly just so everybody can see. Make sure you know where you are. Your work should be coming from the right hand needle. So I'm going to bring my yarn in the front because I'm on 2 purl stitches. So you do 2 purl stitches. And then you have to reposition your yarn to do a knit stitch. And it's very important that you bring your yarn in between the needles. You don't want to get it caught up on one of the needles. So bring it in between the needles. And now I'm ready to do 2 knit stitches. So that's what you do. You complete 2 inches of ribbing. Now, when I make stuff, I always like to throw my own spin on it. So on this hat, you can see I think I did 3.5 inches. I did more ribbing. So, you know, you don't have to follow the pattern. You don't have to do exactly what it's telling you. You know, feel free to, you know, add or subtract, you know, see how you like it. You never know what you're going to like or how you're going to feel about it. So it says you're casting on color A with smaller needles, casting on 80 stitches, and you're going to work your ribbing. And it wants you to change to larger needles. So you cast on with the smaller needles, and then you change to larger needles at that point. And then you're going to do increases. So change to larger needles. And so you're going to do an increase. You're going to knit 1, and then you're going to KF and B. So nobody knows what that means, right? KF and B? We're going to figure it out. So you knit 1, you KF and B, and you repeat around. You're going to increase to 120 stitches. So you're going to start with 80, and you're going to end up with 120. And it is very important that you have the exact stitch count. Usually, I don't think it matters always, but for Fair Isle and anytime you're following a chart, you really do have to have the exact stitch count. So be very careful. I'm going to show you how to do the knit front and back. So I'm going to put the stitch marker here to mark my beginning.
Darren, can you move your hands just a little bit farther up? Thank you.
All right, so knit front and back, you start out. So I'm going to do my knit 1 first, and then knit front and back. You enter the stitch just like normal, wrap your yarn, bring your stitch through, and then you enter the stitch through the back loop, wrap your yarn, and then bring that one through as well. I kind of split my yarn, so there you go. So knit 1, and then knit front and back. So you enter the stitch, wrap your yarn, bring your loop through, and then you switch and go through the back, wrap your yarn, bring that loop through, and there you have it. You've increased by 1. And when you do the knit front and back, you always end up getting this little bump, which kind of looks like a purl bump, and people think, oh, I've done it wrong because it's left that little bump, but that's exactly what happens when you knit front and back. So once you've completed your increases, it tells you to begin chart 1. And that sounds easy enough, right? We're going to follow chart 1. Okay, any questions right now or ready to move on to the chart?
I think we're all set to move on and get into this chart business.
So this is what a chart looks like for knitting Fair Isle. And frequently within a project, there'll be more than one chart. There could be 3 or 4 or 5 different charts. This one you have 2 different charts. And so chart 1 is all we have to worry about right now. So we don't even have to think about that other one, which looked very complicated, but it's really not. But for now, we're not even going to think about it. So it seems much easier already, right? So when you're following a chart, you always start at the bottom, and it usually gives you a clue because it says number 1. And you start on this side, on the right side, and you go across. And it says this is a 4-stitch repeat. Now what that means is we're going to keep repeating these same 4 stitches all around the hat. So you're going to knit 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you finish that repeat, and then you're going to start it again, and you're going to repeat that so many times around the hat, and that's what's going to create your stitch pattern. And each one of these squares represents 1 stitch. So the white square and the gray square each identify a different color. So that's telling you which color to use where. So you can pick any colors you want, and then you can decide which one's the white one and which one's the gray one, and you just follow it along in that way. Now what I want you to look at on this chart, so we start with row 1. That's just all 1 color, right? So that's just knitting. You just knit 1 whole color all the way around. That's not hard. And now row 2, it doesn't have a number for 2, but it just lists every other number. Row 2, that's just gray, white, gray, white. Now that's not complicated. You might not know how to do it, but we're going to show you in a minute. And then row 3, that's just knitting 1 color. Row 4 is just knitting 1 color. And then row 5, that's just white, gray, white, gray. That's not very complicated. This is the most complicated one in this chart, and it's gray, 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 white. Now that's not so hard. So even though it looks very complicated, that chart is actually, once you just look at it line by line, it's actually quite easy. And one way to help keep it easy and keep yourself from getting confused is you can use a Post-it note to keep track. So I've done row 1. I'm going to move my Post-it note up. Now I'm ready for row 2. So I finished row 2, move my Post-it note up to row 3, and just so on and so forth. Now if it's easy to look at the wrong line and start doing the wrong color combination. So you want to try to avoid that if you can. So if you have a hard time keeping your eye in the right place, you can use 2 Post-it notes and block out everything except for the row you're working on. So if that's all you're looking at, if that's all you have to do to get through the row, that looks pretty easy. So I think we can all learn this, and I think we can all do it really, really well. Okay, any questions about how to read this chart? I'm going to show you actually how to do it, but this is just kind of how it's set up and how we're going to read it. Okay.
We had a couple other good tips about how to keep track of where you are in the chart. Beverly uses a magnetic board that she got at Michael's. I have seen those before, where you sort of have like a little ribbon and you move it up as you go. Diana says, of course, you can just also use a highlighter or a pencil and cross out as you go, whichever way works for you.
Yep,
I just also wanted a little bit of a pedantic thing here, that even though Darren is saying rows, technically you'll be working in rounds all around.
Yes,
A lot of people use them interchangeably, but just to make the point that you are knitting in a continuous spiral.
Yes, thank you, Claire. I kind of use it. I use knitting and crochet interchangeably too. In my brain, they're all the same thing. So, I'm going to skip row 1 because it's just, you know, knitting. You don't want to see me knit all the way around in white. So I'm going to jump to row 2 where it's gray, white, gray, white. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that'll help you. And we're going to talk about some problems that we might face as we're knitting. All right. So I have my white yarn, of course, is attached because I've been knitting with it. And so I want to knit with this red. And so people always make it such a crisis to join another strand of yarn. So it's so easy that people don't want it to be easy and they turn it into a crisis. So I'm going to show you how I do it, and you really don't even have to think about it. So you enter your stitch just like normal. You wrap your yarn just like normal. Oops. And then you bring it through. So that's just joining the yarn. You don't do anything fancy. You just enter the stitch, wrap the yarn, and bring that through. So I'll show you again. I have a hard time, I'm looking at my work through my camera, and it kind of throws me off. If I try to look at my work not through my camera, then I end up putting my hands down lower. So if I make a mistake, be forgiving. Okay, so you enter the stitch. And so I'm going to add my red yarn. So the red yarn's not joined. I'm going to just wrap it around. You don't have to make a loop. You don't have to tie a knot. You don't have to do anything crazy. And then you just bring it through. Okay, super easy. So red, white. I'm just going to do this and then I'll talk about what I'm doing. Red, white. So now I've completed one whole repeat. So one whole repeat. And what I like to do, and you can live your life as you choose, but after I finish a repeat, what I want to do is I put a stitch marker. And then I know that every time I come to a stitch marker, I finished my repeat. And if I come to the stitch marker and I'm not right, like if I'm doing this row and I'm red, white, and I come to my stitch marker and I'm ending on a red, then I know I've messed up. But then the question will be, when did you mess up? So you can look at each one of your repeats and decide where the mistake was. So it's much easier to find a mistake. So I like to do that to kind of keep my place in it. Okay. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways. I hold my yarn in my left hand. And when I do Fair Isle, I hold it like this. And I enter the stitch, and then I choose which color I'm going to use. And I just wrap it. Like this. And one thing also you want to remember is once you start holding your yarn a certain way, I have the white yarn on top and the red yarn is on the bottom. You want to make sure you always maintain the same way. If you change it mid project, it can really show up and it shows a big difference. Claire, which color is more dominant? The one on the top or the bottom? I can never remember.
Ooh, that is a good question. I think it's generally the one on the top, but it does depend a little bit on like your knitting style. Are you holding them both in one hand? Do you have one color in each hand? So it's a little bit of variable. Good rule of thumb though is just pick something and stick with it.
Yeah, so one of the colors will be more dominant and show up a little bit more. And it's really not noticeable until you switch it, and now the other color is showing up more, and then it's visibly very clear where you switched it. So you don't want to have that on your project. So I want to show you the back, and I'll probably show you on the other hat because we want to talk about the floats. So when we're not using the yarn, when I use the red yarn, the white yarn is just resting. And so it's not being used. So what happens is it just gets carried along the back. And we carry it along the back until it's time to knit with that color. And what happens is when this yarn is carried across the back, that creates a float. It's called a float or a strand. And that's what you're going to see in stranded knitting or in Fair Isle. you get that little float. And what you want to do is you always want to try to keep your tension even. That's going to come with practice. If you knit, I'm going to show you what happens if you knit too and you pull your floats too tight. So I'm going to do red, white. I'm going to try to pull them really tight. It might not show up on this. And then red, I'm going to pull it really tight on purpose just to show you. And then white, so I pulled it super tight. Now, you can see it does change the gauge, but what it does, it changes the way these floats are acting. And so instead of having a nice float, I really can't even see them because they're kind of buried underneath. And what that'll do is that'll make your project so tight that it won't be comfortable. You won't even be able to put this hat on probably, because if you think about how stretchy is a strand of yarn, it's not really stretchy at all. So if you pull your floats very, very tight, it'll make it so it's not stretchy, and it'll also cause puckering in the front. So that's going to come with practice, and that means, just buy some yarn or use some yarn you already have at home and just do a practice piece. Like, you don't want to start with the hat, go buy expensive yarn and start with the hat that you're giving someone for Christmas and then be upset when it doesn't look right. Just start with practice with yarn that's not so special, and then you will be able to practice and get your tension right. So I'm going to show you a couple of other ways that you can do it, how to hold your yarn in your hands. So you can hold.
I just wanted to interject something, Darren.
Okay.
You were saying about when you pull the yarn too tight across the back. I know as knitters and crafters, we always like to say, oh, you can block that out. It'll block out just fine. Not always. So remember to keep it nice and loose and be relaxed.
If you pull it too tight, it won't block out much at all, because if this, you can't stretch that. You can stretch knitted fabric because the stitches are stretchy, but if you have super tight floats, she's right, you can't really block it to fix it.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to hold my yarn one in each hand. So I've got my white on this side, and I've got my red on this side. And so once you set that up, you want to maintain, white on one side and red on the other side, and you don't want to mix that up. Now, I don't knit this way, so it's going to look a little awkward probably. So you do red, white, red, white. So that's knitting with one on each side. Now, when I do it, I always keep them both in my left hand. And so if I try to do it this way, usually by the end of the round, somehow they both end up back in my left hand. So that's just the way I'm supposed to do it, I guess. So I'll show you that again, and you can try all the different ways. So red, white, red, white. So that's knitting with yarn in one in each hand. Now you can also do it, you can knit them with both in your right hand. And again, I don't do it this way, so it might not look quite so smooth. Okay.
Quick question, Darren. I don't know if you mentioned this at the top of class or not. What size needles are you using? And just which yarn is this? Okay,
so the pattern, I think I'm using 7s or 8s. The pattern calls for, I think the pattern calls for 7s and 9s, doesn't it? 7-inch and 8-inch. A size 7 16-inch circular and a size 8 16-inch circular. But you want to use the needle that's going to give you the right gauge. So if your knitting's a little tight, then you might want to go up a little bit. If it's loose, you might want to go down a little bit. So that's something that you can decide. And the yarn that I'm using here is the Pound of Love from Lion Brand. And this is available on Michaels.com and also on lionbrand.com. And it is a nice worsted weight yarn. and you get tons and tons. How many yards does it say? 1,020 yards. So that's a lot of yards. That's a lot of hats, right? You might want to use this to make a blanket or something. So that's what I'm using. And
Ooh,
sorry about that. Any more
one,
questions?
not a question, but we had someone mention in the class, ask, are you twisting the different colors in the back? And I just wanted to say that no, you do not do that in Fair Isle, because that will make your strands much less stretchy. And you want them to be able to stretch out and relax. What you might be thinking of if you're twisting different colors of yarn around each other to close up a hole is something called intarsia, which is a totally other thing.
How about a vertical stripe, Claire?
I think probably most Fair Isle patterns try to avoid like a long vertical stripe. And even if, you know, you are doing like, say, 20 rounds of, you know, a 2x2 stripe, as long as your yarns are tensioned evenly, you shouldn't really get like a hole between the two. I mean, technically those two stitches won't be connected to each other, but there's enough connection with the yarn strands in the back that you should be fine.
So see here, I wasn't paying attention and I just started knitting randomly. So I'm gonna take those out. So here's how you can take them out. Go back. So you don't want to just start making up a random pattern as you're going. Okay. Okay, so here's how you do it both in your right hand. So I did my red one. And then just practice and see which is the most comfortable way for you to hold two in one hand. So there's the white. There's the red. And then there's the white. And then you put on your stitch marker. If you don't want to do the stitch markers, then you can live your life the way you choose. But especially as you're learning, and I find it, even as an experienced Fair Isle knitter and stranded knitter, I always use the stitch markers. I want to make sure I'm not messing up. And if I do mess up, I want to know where I messed up. Okay, so there's one more way.
I was going to say, you mentioned stitch markers. Let me scroll back up here. Guinevere wonders, how do you get the stitch markers out when you're done?
Well, the stitch markers are just on your needle. So once you get to the point where you're ready to take them off, once you get to them, you just drop them off. So they're not knitted into your work. They're just resting on the needle. So you never knit the stitch marker. When you come to that stitch marker in your work, like the next time we come around, we'll come to each one of the stitch markers. You just slip the stitch marker over. You don't have to do anything else. So when you come to that stitch marker on the next round, you'll just slip it over. And then when you get to the point where you don't need them anymore, you just take them off. So they're not really, and if you knit them into your work by mistake, which I did frequently when I was learning, then you either have to rip it out or cut them off or something. So that's a whole situation. So.
And then going back to the twisting of the yarn, someone reminded me that occasionally you do have a section where it's a very long float, where you might be working one color over like maybe 10 stitches even. And in that case, you may need to trap that float somehow, just so it's not really loosey-goosey at the back. And there are a couple different ways to do that. We might have time to get into them here.
Okay. So since we brought that up, we'll talk about a few things that are relevant to that. With Fair Isle knitting, I have to be careful because with the way I speak, I sometimes say feral knitting. I just put it all together and it sounds like wild cats are knitting. So it's Fair Isle knitting. You only ever have 2 colors in each row, and that's a very strict rule. And another very strict rule is you don't go more than 5 stitches without changing colors. Some people, some of the traditional Fair Isle knitters from Fair Isle won't go more than 2 stitches without switching colors. So depending on what you want, I never go more than 5 stitches without switching colors, and sometimes I do it every 3, because what happens is I'm just going to do something and then I'll take it out because this is going to get us off pattern, but I want you to see what the long float is, what Claire was talking about. Because this can be a big problem with some other projects. You'll come to it. So let's say you have a whole bunch of red stitches in a row for some reason. And this will help you see what a float really is. So you're doing a different chart. For some reason, you have all these red stitches in a row. And so what you want to make sure you're doing also is you see how these stitches are all bunched up together. They're all bunched up in my hand. And that can, and then when I use my white stitch, if they're all bunched up, I'm going to end up pulling that float really tight. And then my stitches are going to be too tight and my work will look puckery. So what you always want to do when you're doing any type of stranded knitting is you want to stretch your stitches out. Do not let them bunch up in your hands. So stretch them out like that. And every now and then I give them a little snug down to just kind of even them out and make sure they're not super tight. So that's just a little helpful hint. And so for this scenario, we had all those red stitches in a row, and then we have a couple of white stitches, okay? So what we were talking about is this is what a float looks like right here. This yarn is not attached to anything, and it's just kind of floating back there, or it's a strand or a float. And the problem with that is it can get caught if you catch it on your finger, or if you catch it, like if you get it caught on a ring or something, it'll pull and it'll really distort your stitches from the front and make it look really bad. So the way to avoid that, since we brought that up, is, so let's say I have 2 white stitches, I have 3 white stitches. So this is how I do it. I just twist them like that. And there's a red stitch. I know there's some fancy ways to do it. So I'm going to do 3 white stitches, or a whole bunch of white stitches in a row in this situation. And then I twist it like that, so that my yarns are back in the right place. And so when you're twisting it, what can happen is your yarns end up twisted like a barber pole, and sometimes you have to stop and just untwist them. If you're careful, then they don't get twisted. Okay, does that make sense? And then when you go in the back and you look at these red strands, you can see they're not very long. They're not long and loose like that white strand. They're actually staying in place because we caught it right there. We kind of caught it right there. Okay. Any other questions? How are we doing?
I think we're doing pretty good here. I'm gonna say we've got just a little over 20 minutes left, so let's see if we can mosey along to the next round.
Okay, so let's pretend I finished the whole round. And you come to your stitch marker. So the next round in this one, we're not going to be able to go through the whole, of course, the whole chart. So the next round is just white, and the next round is just red. And then round 5 is just the reverse of what we did on round 2. It's white, red, instead of red, white, red, white. So you can see if you just go line by line, it's not very hard at all. It makes perfect sense. And just so you can see what that kind of looks like on this, what you're creating is this right here, this pattern right here. And then you move into this X pattern where it's kind of creating that X. It's either creating an X, I kind of see an X, or it looks like a plus sign, like there. Sometimes that looks like a fleur-de-lis even. So like it could either be a plus sign or it can be an X, depending on how your eye sees that. And that's how it looks. And you, like the repeat starts there and it ends there. So you're just doing these 4 stitches, moving along, and then you do the same 4 again, and then the same 4 again. You just keep going all the way around, repeating it. And that's why you get these repeating patterns. And that's what makes Fair Isle distinctive. The patterns are usually worked up so they look like stripes. Okay. So any questions about how to read that little chart, or you want me to demonstrate anything else? It really just takes practice. When you go to do it, it'll make more sense than when you're just hearing about it. We ready to move on to the next chart?
I think so. I think we could have the finished hat turned inside out, just so people see like what a
Good
bunch
idea.
of floats look like.
Okay, so that you've probably have sweaters that look like this on the inside, right? You've probably seen this before. And so here, this float's a little longer, but it's only 3 stitches, so I didn't have to catch it. So you're not gonna have to worry about that for this pattern, but I like to let people know what they're gonna face in the future, you know, if it's possible. So for this pattern, you don't really have to worry about it, but you can see here, these floats are getting a little long, but they're just 3 stitches, so they're not too long, so it's fine. But if they went 5 stitches, like say this float went from here all the way to there, then that's 6 stitches and that would be a super long float. And you'd want to catch it at that point. Okay, anything else?
I think that's good. We're ready to move on to our next
And
round
there's how
here.
this one looks with the colors. You might be able, that might look a little better or more distinct. Okay, all right, let's try to jump back ahead. So we finished this entire chart. And once you finish the chart, you just remove all of the stitch markers because the next chart is different. So you just take all the stitch markers off as you come to them. And then you're going to want to start the next chart. Now this just looks crazy, right? What are we looking at? This doesn't make any sense at all. It's absolutely crazy and we don't know what to do. So what we're looking at here is this one is a 20 stitch repeat. So the other one was only 4 stitches, so it was very easy to remember, just like knit, like red, white, red, white, red, white. Where this one is going to be a little harder to memorize the pattern, but you'll be surprised. By the time you get all the way around, you'll have it in your mind. So this, if you look at the chart, you can see that it's symmetrical. It has a center row, and then this and this are exactly the same. They're kind of mirror image of each other. So it's very symmetrical. And one thing that helps me when I'm knitting a chart like this is I always, like, I think about this side as one side, and then I do what I'm doing in the middle, and then I think about this side as the other side. So I don't think of it as 20 stitches. I kind of break it up in my mind in 3 smaller sections. And sometimes I will even put a stitch marker in the center, a different one, so that way I know when I'm at the center. It's just easier to keep track. So if you have a hard time keeping track, again, you can use your Post-it notes and stitch markers. Really help to keep it on track. So this really just looks crazy. So what do we do? I mean, why is there empty space? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. But what this is trying to represent is a round piece of the top of the hat. So let me turn the hat back. So what it's representing is this piece on the top of the hat, and you can see it gets smaller as it goes up. And so on a 2-dimensional piece, you can't really make it smaller as it goes up. So I'm gonna try to fold it if I can quickly. So this row here would actually be connected to that. So it would be like that. And then this one also would be connected. And if you cut that out and taped it together, then you would see that it creates more of a rounded top. So that's what it's trying to represent. So sometimes when I look at that, I get very overwhelmed. So just remember, it's not hard. They're not trying to trick you. So the way you read that chart is you start here at the beginning at 1, you go all the way across, and you can see you're not doing anything fancy here. It's just all the way across. Everything's normal. And then row 2, everything seems pretty normal. And then you get to row 3, and that's where everything kind of falls apart, right? That looks crazy. So what does that mean? We don't know what that means. We have to figure that out. But what it tells us is here, this is the legend, this is the key, and it tells you what each one of those stitches or those little boxes represent. And what that represents is SK2P, and this might be a new thing for you. I'm going to show you how to do it. You slip 1 as if to knit, then you knit 2 together, and then you pass the slip stitch over, and then you decrease by 2. So that sounds really complicated, right? But actually, if you just take it one step at a time, it's not complicated at all. So do you want me to demonstrate that now, or I think it's a good time to demonstrate that? So let me get this out of the way. And then we'll bring this hat back. And so I just happened to stop this hat in just the right place. It was very lucky that I stopped it in just the right place. Let me see what row I'm on. So a couple of things I want to show you on this round. So I'm on row 8, it looks like. Let's see. No, 9. Wait a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. So how to figure it out, you kind of count. So 1, 2, 3, 4 of the dark color. And then if you look on here, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the dark color. So that looks like that's where I am. Because I'm starting with 1 white one. So start with 1 white one and then 4 dark ones. So that's kind of how you look for your place. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my Post-it note there. So that's keeping me track of what I'm doing. So I'm going to demonstrate this. So I already knit my white stitch so that my stitch markers wouldn't fall off. And sometimes I'll put a stitch marker like this to make it distinctive so I know where the beginning is. All right? So I'm going to knit 4, 3, okay, wait a second. I made a mistake. Because I had that stitch count the way I was looking at it, that means I've already completed these. And that means I'm ready to go to the next one. So I almost made a mistake. So it's easy to get off track, so you have to pay attention. Okay, so I knit 1 white, 1, 2, 3 of the burgundy. And then it says knit 1 white, 1 white. Okay, so now I'm right here. So knit 1 white, knit 3 burgundy, knit 1 white. Now, how do you do this big jump? Like, what is that? Like that's crazy. But you don't do anything there. You just skip to the next square. So you knit this white one, and then you just skip here. You pretend, there's nothing there, so you just don't do anything. And then you do this, and this is where we do our double decrease. And I'm going to show you how to do that. And then after you do this, you just go to the next square. You don't get hung up and wondering that's like an abyss. You can fall into it and be stuck there forever. So just jump over it and just jump to the next one. All right? So that it gets a little confusing when you're learning. Okay. So how we do that, it is an SK2P, and it's really quite simple. You slip, and it says to slip it as if to knit. Most of the time when you're slipping a stitch, you slip it as if to purl because you don't want to twist your stitches. But this one, it says slip it as if to knit. So you just enter the stitch as if you were going to do a knit stitch, but then you don't, you just switch it over. And what that does is it kind of twists your stitch, and that's what we want in this case. So you slip one as if to knit, and then you knit 2 together. That's super easy. You just go through 2 stitches just like normal, just like it was 1 stitch, but you're going through 2. Wrap your yarn and bring it through. Now that's a decrease. So I've decreased by 1. So we did our slip, we did our knit 2 together, and now we're going to pass our slip stitch over. So let me see if I get this good. You just take your knitting needle and you go into that slipped one. So you're skipping the knit 2 together, you go into the slipped one, and you just drag it off and let it fall off the edge. Kind of like when you do a bind off. It jumps over and it falls off the edge. And it doesn't unravel because it loops around your knit 2 together. And it's a decrease, but it's also very decorative. So you can see it kind of creates, it almost looks like a cable. So that's why, you might wonder, like, why are we doing this crazy thing? But it actually has a nice look to it and gives it some texture. Okay. So
Going
now,
back to, oops, sorry, Darren.
okay, go ahead.
Going back to when you were explaining that big gap in the chart, Beverly had a good analogy. If you sew it all, that little gap there would represent where you're making a dart, which is sort of the
Yes.
same thing where you're bringing the fabric together.
Yeah.
And then Diana had a good question. How do you know which color to use on the decrease?
Well, it's white, right? The squares are all white. So they could be different colors. It could be white, red, and then green or something. But you just do whatever the square is. The square is white, it's white. Right up here so you can see it. I'm still getting used to this. So each one of those squares was white. So you just use the white one. Does that make sense?
Yes, I was going to say, I think sometimes people get hung up if you're decreasing in Fair Isle and you're like, well, the 3 stitches I'm decreasing might be 2 reds and 1 white. So which color do I use? But you're just using the color that is the square of the decrease. Don't ignore what the previous row did. You're done with that. Let it go.
Yeah, sometimes that's a problem. Like when I was trying to find out where I was in this pattern, I was looking at the row that I finished, thinking that's the row I was on, which is a very easy mistake to make. So just be very careful that you don't do that. And the row below is going to be different than the row above usually. So I'm going to do this one more time. So I'm going to slip the stitch as if to knit, and then knit 2 together, 2 together, and then pass. So you just kind of go through that one without splitting your yarn and pass it over, and it's almost like a little bind off. All right? Any questions about that?
Well, Beverly is just on fire with the hot tips today. Wow, I'm sorry, guys, I'm not hip. But she points out, and I do this as well, you can make a copy of the chart. And then if you're having trouble like deciding what colors to use, or if you're using really different colors than what's used in the pattern, get your crayons or your colored pencils out and color in all those tiny little squares.
Okay, so what I do, instead of copying the chart, like on a copy machine or something, is go buy graph paper at an office supply store, and it's the same thing, and you can just color the chart in that way. It's what I like to do. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead since we understand that. So at some point, and I'm almost to that point on this hat, as we continue with our double decreases, it's going to become too small for me to stay on these 16-inch circular needles. And so I'm going to have to change to double pointed needles, or you could change to magic. You could be doing the whole thing in magic loop, or you could change to magic loop at this point. So the way you switch to double pointed needles is you just knit from one to the other. So, I dropped my yarn. So I'm going to do my white, my 3 burgundy, and then I'm going to do my white, and then my double decrease. I'm going to slip, knit 2 together, and then pass the slip stitch over. And then just follow your chart. And then you don't want to put too many stitches on each one because you don't want to risk dropping them off the edge. You can buy point protectors or stitch stoppers to keep them from dropping off if you need to. You might want to put, just figure out what a fairly even amount is to put them on all 3. Maybe you want to put them on 4 double points and knit with the 5th one, which I don't usually do, but if that's going to make you feel a little safer, then that's what you do. And so then I'm done with that, so I'm just going to go to the next one. And so because I want to maintain my stitch marker, you have to kind of knit the next stitch of the next repeat to hold it on, or else it'll just fall off. So if you want to maintain the stitch markers, which I really like to do, So red. Any questions while I'm getting caught up here? White. And then my decrease. And pass it over. And then just finish off in pattern. All right, well, how do you guys feel about double pointed needles? Some people really hate them.
I mean, you know, I'm on the side of Magic Loop, but I will say I do use double points for the top of my hat because it's usually not for that long and it keeps everything spread out nice and even, and I can still try the hat on if I want to.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
So I think if you're knitting on 16-inch circulars and then you get to the end and have to decrease, I don't know if most people would do Magic Loop, or I always do double points, but that's what I like better. So live your life as you choose. Decide what's your best. So knit the one. And so I would put more stitches on this, but just for the sake of saving time, I knitted the whole thing, and then I put the next stitch from the next repeat on there to maintain my stitch marker, because I like to maintain that. And as you can see, I have yellow stitch markers dividing up my repeats. And earlier, when I had a lot more stitches down here, when it was 20, I put a red stitch marker in the center. So when I got to that red stitch marker, I knew it was time to do my double decrease, so I didn't skip it. But I also would take a second and make sure if it said I was supposed to end on red or blue at this one, I was ending on the right stitch and the right color. And if I wasn't, then I knew I made a mistake somewhere between here and here. So I didn't have to go back and try to figure out the whole hat. I knew the mistake was here because the repeat of right before that one ended up right. So that's why I like to do that. And then you can decide if it's something you want to do or not. It's not something everyone does. It's just a little helpful hint. Okay, any other questions?
I was going to say, we did have a few other questions to finish up here because we are almost at 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Let me scroll back here. I think it was Diane had noticed that in that central column of decreases, some of the stitches have a symbol and some of them don't. So she just wondered what the difference was.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So most of the stitches here don't have a symbol, right? Most of them are just, you know, little squares with nothing in them, and that just indicates the color. So when you come to the center one here, and you come to that symbol, you do your double decrease. And then on the next round, when you come to that square, there's no symbol, so you just knit straight across these as normal. So you would just knit, you would have 3 burgundy, you would have 3 white, and then you would finish with 3 burgundy, or whatever colors you're using. You just knit that square as normal as all the other white squares. Okay? Any other question? That's a very good question.
We did have another question. Could you use 9-inch circular needles instead of double points or magic loop to close up the top of the hat?
Yeah, you can use, there's lots of different ways to accomplish the same thing. So however you knit like tiny objects, you know, that'll work. 9-inch circulars would probably be fine, but once you want to get completely and close that hat completely up, they might be too big as well, or you might be able to do it. You know, try it. I always say try it and see how it works for you. Anything else? These charts, I just really want to review it with everybody and just let you know, this looks so intimidating and this looks so complicated, and it's not. I mean, I really think if you take it one row at a time, and you can see it's just like, you know, white, red, white, red, white, red, white, white, red, white, white. I mean, it's not, you're not creating this whole pattern. See, I think what we think of when we look at this is we think, oh my gosh, I have to create this whole pattern. But you're just doing it one row at a time, so it's very easy.
Well,
and then once you get more comfortable,
Can you put the finished hat up there for a minute, Darren? We had a couple questions to see what this is all going to end up looking like.
So this is the top. Okay, maybe let's go back to the facing camera, the front facing. Okay, so here's what the hat looks like. Here's what the hat looks like when you're done. And a couple of choices now at this point. You can wear just like a normal slouchy hat, and that's fine. Or if you, the traditional way of tam is it looks more like a beret, right? So it kind of looks like this. And if you want to block it and make it look like this, the easiest way to do that is you take the hat and you soak it in some, you could use some like wool wash or something. It's a nice chance to wash your hat. Get it very wet, let it soak for like a half hour or so, and then wrap it up in a towel and blot most of the water out of it. You don't want it dripping and sopping wet. And then you just get a dinner plate from your cupboard and you just stretch the hat around the dinner plate. And you want to kind of even it out to make sure you don't want to block it in some weird configuration. And then just kind of make sure before it dries, just kind of line it up so it's even all the way around. And then you let that dry, maybe overnight, maybe it, depending on how long it takes to dry. And now your hat is shaped in the shape of a beret. So you can decide how you want it to be. But it's kind of pretty that way, right?
Yeah, and I just posted it in the chat, but I wanted to remind people who aren't watching that too that the pattern we use today to demonstrate is the Gretchen's Easy Tam. It's available for free on lionbrand.com. You can just start typing in Gretchen, it should pop up. Also, as another reminder, the recording of this class will be available tomorrow at michaels.com/classes. And then we did have another question. Are we going to be having any other classes? We are going to have classes on August 17th and 24th. We will let you know what those are going to be. You can sign up for those also at michaels.com/classes.
I just want to point out one thing. This style of knitting, this is not Fair Isle because the pattern's not worked up in stripes. So when you get these pictures, that's just stranded knitting. So there's always that one person that will correct you, and you can say, oh, I made a Fair Isle sweater, and they'll be like, no, you didn't. That's not Fair Isle. That's something else. That's more Icelandic or Norwegian. So this is stranded knitting, and for Fair Isle, it looks more like this. Or like this. See how it works up in stripes? Okay. Yes, that's it. Anything else quickly?
I think we're all good. Everybody seems to have gotten the hang of this or is well on their way to practicing. And it is all about practicing. So.
And you can get these supplies on michaels.com. You can get the pattern from lionbrand.com. And if you want to find me on Instagram and ask a question, if you get stuck, you could post a picture and show me what you're doing, how it looks. Maybe Claire will put it in the comments. It's Mr. Woolly Bear on Instagram. So Mr. spelled out M-I-S-T-E-R and then just Woolly Bear. I guess that's it. Enjoy. Have fun knitting.
Thanks, everybody.